guys, welcome back to another episode of the Bible Vlog. Today we are covering Acts chapter 26. So in the previous chapter we covered, Paul is actually brought before a king named Agrippa, and what he wants to hear is what Paul has been teaching. Now King Agrippa is actually visiting governor of Festus, but he has Paul brought out to give his testimony as well as to show what he is being accused of by these Jewish leaders. So starting in verse 1, we read that Paul is actually given the floor to explain what he's being accused of and what his experience with Jesus has been. Now listen to this in verse 1. Then Agrippa said to Paul, "You are permitted to speak for yourself." So Paul stretched out his hand and answered for himself and said this, "I think myself happy, King Agrippa, because today I shall answer for myself before you concerning all the things of which I am accused by the Jews, especially because you are an expert in all customs and questions which have to do with the Jews. Therefore, I beg you to hear me patiently." So Paul goes on to give his complete testimony of what God has done in his life. He then proceeds to walk the governor Festus and King Agrippa through all of it. How he was originally a Pharisee and persecuted the Christians. How he encountered Jesus on the road to Damascus and then became a Christian himself. And finally, how he has since gone about preaching to the Jews, the Gentiles, anyone who will listen about Jesus Christ. Now, Paul goes through all of this in front of the king, in front of the governor, and also in front of a large crowd of people, and look at their reactions. In verse 24, now as Paul made his defense, Festus, the governor, said with a loud voice, "Paul, you are beside yourself. Much learning is driving you mad." In other words,
I'm not listening to you. You're crazy.
you're spending so much time focusing on this Jesus stuff. You're spending so much time teaching and preaching. It's making you insane. But then in verse 25, Paul responds, "I am not mad, most noble Festus, but speak the words of truth and reason." So the governor Festus is literally thinking Paul is just out of his mind. He's insane. But now look at what Paul says to King Agrippa. Now keep in mind, Agrippa had a Jewish heritage and believes in the Old Testament, the prophets, what they taught. So look at what Paul says to him in verse 27. "King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know that you do believe." Then Agrippa said to Paul in verse 28, "You almost persuade me to become a Christian." You see, even King Agrippa, who is being very honest in this moment, recognizes that everything Paul is teaching about Jesus does actually line up with what the prophets said about the Messiah. Now, obviously, he's trying not to offend the governor who just said that he thinks Paul is crazy, as well as all of the Jews who we know wants to kill Paul, but he recognizes that what Paul is talking about makes sense. And it's obvious by his answers that he's impressed. Now, when Paul is done speaking, it actually says that King Agrippa, his wife, and Festus go inside, and then listen to what it says in verse 31. "And when they had gone inside, they talked among themselves, saying, 'This man has done nothing deserving of death or chains.'" And in verse 32, "Then Agrippa said to Festus, 'This man might have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar.'" Now, ultimately, we know that Paul's calling was to go to Rome to even present the gospel to Caesar himself. But what's amazing is this, is these guys are looking at Paul. They're saying everything that he's saying makes sense. But in spite of Paul's conditions, they're simply saying if he would have just not appealed to Caesar, he could have stayed right where he was, and no doubt he would have gone free. But Paul knows his ultimate destination is to preach the gospel to every single person on the planet, including Caesar himself. Guys, that is going to be it for us today with Acts 26. Thank you as always for joining us. Come back tomorrow. We're going to pick it up in Acts chapter 27. Hope you all have a very, very beautiful day. We'll see you guys.